Welcome everyone to this conversation about the food crisis and starvation in Gaza with the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to food, Professor Michael Fakhri, hosted by the Australian Human Rights Institute. Thank you everyone for joining us. My name is Noam Peleg, and I'm a senior lecturer at the Faculty of Law and Justice at the University of New South Wales. I would like to start by acknowledging that I'm joining from the unceded land of the Bidjigal people and to extend my respect to the elder, past, present, and emerging, and to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Island person who is joining the webinar or any other Indigenous person who is watching this recording. Food is key to the culture of the Bidjigal people. Being a coastal dwelling, fish was the main source of food. The freshwater streams around this beautiful country provided enough fish, shellfish, fruits, vegetables, wallabies, possums, and birds that they could eat, and honey that allowed one to go fishing in the morning and hunting in the afternoon. This conversation also coincides with the first day of Eid al-Fitr, which ends the month of Ramadan. So Eid Mubarak to everyone who marks this day. Food holds profound significance during Ramadan and Eid al-Fitr, representing spiritual, communal, and cultural dimensions. Throughout Ramadan, fasting from dawn till dusk symbolizes empathy for the less fortunate, and the evening meal, the iftar, symbolizes gratitude and unity among families and communities. Food during Ramadan and Eid al-Fitr transcends mere substance. It's a language of love, solidarity, and devotion. This food, famine, and starvation of the 2.3 million people who live in Gaza is our topic today. An integrated food security phase classification report that came out in March 2024 shows that 1.1 million Palestinians in Gaza, half of the population, face catastrophic levels of hunger, and 1 in 3 children below the age of 2 are acutely malnourished. The rest of the population face food insecurity at levels 2 and 3, defined as people who are either in crisis or in stress. The IPC report further projects that by July 2024, in 4 months, this number would increase significantly. It led the UN Secretary General to warn that Palestinians in Gaza are enduring horrific levels of hunger and suffering. A report published by Human Rights Watch just yesterday, April 9th, showed that children in Gaza have been dying from starvation-related complications since Israel began using starvation as a weapon of war, which is a war crime. The report includes testimonies from doctors and families in Gaza who describe children, pregnant and breastfeeding mothers suffering from severe malnutrition and dehydration, and hospitals who are ill-equipped to treat them. We will talk about the situation on the ground, the causes for this man-made famine, the history, and the relevance of law with the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to food, Professor Michael Fakhri. Professor Fakhri is a professor at the University of Oregon School of Law, where he teaches courses on human rights, food law, development, and commercial law. He is also the director of the Food Resilience Project in the Environment and Nature Resources Law Center. He was appointed Special Rapporteur on the right to food by the Human Rights Council in March 2020 and assumed his function on May 1st, 2020. Professor Fakhri, welcome to this webinar.
Thank you, Noam. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you very much for joining us. So to kick off this conversation, I would wonder if you can just let us tell us in a few words about what the Special Rapporteur is, what your role and mandates are, and what and where you fit in the overall human rights structure of the UN.
Yeah, so as you said, I'm the Special Rapporteur on the right to food. That's one of the mandates amongst over 40 mandates that are there. Water, for example, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, right to health. These are all what fall under what's called special procedures. We're all volunteers, those of us that hold these mandates. Some work in working groups. We're not paid. I mean, it's more or less a full-time job that's not paid on top of our already existing obligations. The way I've experienced this position is I'm the eyes, ears, and sometimes good conscience for the UN system on all matters regarding hunger, malnutrition, and famine from a human rights perspective. Some of my obligations that include writing official reports that I present once a year to the Human Rights Council and once a year to the General Assembly, and I get to pick the topic. Also, I receive complaints from rights holders and raise formal concerns to governments on the record or to corporations or international organizations. So creating a record of human rights violations. And I do country visits. So we do official visits. We do twice a year where we go to a country and in my case, focusing on the right to food and provide an official report. But really, another way to understand the job is my job is to talk to everybody and to learn from everybody and to share what I learn with everyone on the right to food.
Thank you. So right to food, what does it mean in 2 sentences?
Everybody has the right to access good food, food that makes them healthy, that makes their community stronger, that makes the environment more biodiverse. And accessing that food, we do that in a lot of different ways. Either it's access to land and being able to grow our own food, maybe it's hunting and fishing rights, but it's also that our markets work properly, that prices are fair and stable, and that we have the time. We have the time to get food, to go hunting, to go fishing, to go shopping for our food, and to cook food, um, and to work in dignity in our food systems, whether it's working in kitchens, fields, or factories.
So food is more than just a consumption of calories then, which might be more the view that some people might hold as to what your mandate is and therefore what the right to food might mean for them. So looking at this very holistic and broad understanding of the right to food, let's zoom into what's going on in the Gaza Strip today and in the last 6 months. And I'm talking about the famine, which is a situation, and starvation, which is a verb. And if you can tell us a bit more what's from what you know, how things look on the ground today.
I mean, I basically was incredibly alarmed about Israel's war in Gaza starting October 8th, because on October 8th, Israeli officials announced their starvation campaign. What they announced is a complete siege. They implemented it in the first few weeks of October in the war, which is denying the entry of all food, all water, and all medicine into Gaza. Um, and that campaign of starvation continues. It continues today. So Israel is either restricting or denying the entry of humanitarian aid. When humanitarian aid is making its way through land, which is the most effective means, is through land. These humanitarian convoys are coordinating their position with the Israeli Defense Forces. Nevertheless, Israeli forces are bombarding these convoys. There are over 15, 16 different reports. That's just the bare minimum. There's obviously more instances of this, of Israeli forces bombarding humanitarian convoys. And then even if those convoys make it through and reach civilians, then there are several reports, time and time again, of then Israeli forces shooting civilians while they're accessing aid. That's just humanitarian aid. Israel is destroying the food system in Gaza. It is destroying agricultural land. It's destroying greenhouses. It's destroyed fishing ports. It's decimated the fishing vessels. And what's important to note is this also didn't start October 7 or October 8. Israel has been imposing a blockade against Palestinian people in Gaza for 17 years. It's been strangling Gaza. Israel's been strangling Gaza for over 17 years. So the result of all of this is we have never seen a civilian population made to go hungry so completely and so quickly in any time in modern history. 2.3 million people were made to go hungry at a speed we've never seen. And so this is just an introduction in terms of the context, but that context gives you a sense of how Israel was able to do it. The fact that they announced that they were doing it, and then now we're seeing the effects in a very horrific way.
I mean, you've mentioned that Gaza is under siege for 17 years, and that's the context, but we can go back in history, even beforehand. Gaza is controlled by Israel since 1967, and the control on the agricultural sector and on how people fish and grow food and distribute food didn't start today. And there's a well-documented history published a few weeks ago by Neve Gordon and Muna Haddad, the New York Review, called The Road to Famine in Gaza, documenting different steps that Israel has been taking to control and then to shrink the food production system in Gaza by and large by different players. then in 2002, 22 years ago, a piece published by the British Medical Journal suggested that the number of children in Gaza suffering from malnutrition had doubled just in 2 years, when more restrictions were imposed. So that predates the siege, started in 2007, and I think, and then using your holistic and broad definition of the right to food is also a question of manufacture. So in 2007, before aid convoys were restricted, Israel started to reduce into food, electricity, and solar supply to Gaza. So one won't necessarily associate electricity and diesel and the potential implementation of the right to food. But then when this matter was litigated at the High Court in Israel, it was suggested, being part of the lawyers who argued that case, that denying food results in bakeries not being able to produce bread, which would have a trickle-down effect on those who need to consume bread on a daily basis, let alone the effects on hospitals and other on refrigerators. One cannot store food if there is inconsistent supply of electricity. And then we saw the state reply using the same replies that they are giving today, saying it's not a matter of, it's an issue of distribution. So there will be enough electricity provided to Gaza. So then the Hamas government can decide whether it allocates the electricity to hospitals and bakeries or to produce, as the propaganda often goes, to produce rockets, irrespectively of whether the fact that if the grid can actually be controlled this way or not. Similar argument is being made today. There is enough food coming in through the aid convoys into Gaza, and there is an issue of distribution. What do you make about this difference, if it's any relevant difference, or if it's even true, the distinction between quantity of food and the distribution of food?
Yeah, no, first, I really appreciated that the context you've brought into the conversation. That's quite right. Like the degree of control Israel has had over Gaza spans decades. That's exactly right. And so 2007, the moment of the siege, is an acute moment. And that we're in that continuation of that longer history right now. And sure, distribution matters. That's often the case in food. But again, within this context, what's that mean then? Food is not being able to be distributed. What are humanitarian workers telling us? It's because they're being bombarded. It's because there is the only hope to get food to people is a ceasefire. So denying food, fuel, to your point, housing, when you destroy people's homes, where are they going to be able to cook? It's all interconnected. So if you decimate the civic infrastructure to the degree of what we're seeing in Gaza, of course it's going to lead to hunger and famine. Of course it is starvation. And again, just to reiterate, and Israel said that's their plan. Like that's the part that's really frustrating for me from a sense of accountability. Is that they announced that they wanted to deny civilians access to food, fuel, water, and medicine. So to say that, oh, there's enough quantity, but it's an issue of distribution, that's really a very small part of the story, and that doesn't tell us, that doesn't describe actually what's happening on the ground. It doesn't account for the context. It's not what humanitarian workers are telling us. And this degree of starvation is only the result of systemic structural choices that have been made by an occupying power, in this case, Israel.
And more than 230 aid workers have been killed by Israel since October 7, including the incident from last week, where 3 cars were targeted from the air. And you've mentioned aid workers being one of the sources for information. There is often a question that comes up about how you get the information from, or for that matter, other special rapporteurs or UN agencies, in terms of being able to be on the ground, collecting information by yourself, or being done by proxy, or other governmental UN agencies, how one gets what's happening at a war zone.
Yeah. First, I'll speak in general terms how special rapporteurs get information, and then specifically to Gaza, amongst other war zones. So first, we are brought on as experts. So there is a sense of our analysis, our study, our perspective, and our own experience. So we are asked as special rapporteurs to exercise a degree of judgment, is part of the job, and to do our own research. Second, we get direct testimonials from people. We engage directly with communities, with individuals whose rights have been violated. And that's always a very sensitive practice. One has to protect people's safety, their identity. So there's a high degree of trust there. But I find it's similar to a relationship between a lawyer and a client in that there's that space of privilege there. And then, of course, we rely on statistics. Often, in the case of Gaza, I would say almost 90% of the time, I'm relying on UN statistics to be consistent and to trust those institutional structures because they tend to actually be on the conservative side on how they're counting. And they tend to be overly cautious. So I sort of err on that side alongside those UN institutions. And then different institutions gather data in different ways. UNRWA, for example, the UN Relief and Work Agency, is present in Gaza. So they are seeing it firsthand and they are reporting firsthand is one example. WHO, to some degree, has a presence on the ground. Some agencies, I know like the World Bank put out a report recently, and they're relying on an organization that's using a lot of satellite imagery. So that's being used more and more. I'm in contact with people directly, with small food producers directly in Gaza, myself, um, and the work of reporters. Now, unfortunately, many reporters have been denied access into Gaza. This is one of the challenges, and that creates this that makes it harder to understand what's going on. Denying humanitarian workers presence, denying reporters, denying my colleagues. So the UN Special Rapporteur on occupied Palestinian territories, Francesca Albanese, it's within her mandate to be there. She was denied access even before the war started, much less now. So many of us have the authority to be there, but it's hard to physically um, to get there. And it's not just facts and figures. People's stories matter. So what's been really interesting is that we are not only witnessing starvation and genocide, we are witnessing people documenting their own the experience of genocide in real time. And we're watching the Palestinian people document how they're being starved in real time. We're seeing the images of people, of adults and children, as they die from starvation. I mean, this is the part that's very unique, I think.
Thank you. So do you consider then a country visit to be able to see things for yourself?
Oh, that's an interesting question. You know, I mean, I've thought about it. To be honest, I think the priority should go to the Special Rapporteur on occupied Palestinian territories, since it's at the core of her mandate. I've thought about it, especially since my upcoming report is going to be on starvation with a focus on Gaza, which I'll present to the General Assembly in October. Um, so I think I'm open to the idea, but uh, right now it's not. It's impossible. But yeah, I think me and I know several other special rapporteurs are keen. And in fact, there's through the Human Rights Council, there's a commission of inquiry that was created um, to engage not just about this war. This is before the war, on broader issues. They're being denied access as well. There's so many human rights actors from the UN that should be allowed access, and they're being denied right now.
That's certainly that's not a new practice in that sense, unfortunately. A number of follow-up questions. I think we're taking that one by one. You mentioned that UNRWA keeps presence on the ground, and I was wondering what were the effects of denying funding to UNRWA resulting from the campaign against UNRWA? How did it materialize on the ground with the aid that was not provided for people?
What this revealed was that this is not just a war in Gaza. This is a war against the Palestinian people as a people. So what Israel did is it raised allegations about 9 employees without providing the evidence. They just raised the allegations. They raised those allegations the day the International Court of Justice pronounced its preliminary judgment. And that same exact day, the major donors, including the United States, amongst others, Canada and others, immediately responded to these unfounded allegations by saying, we are going to cut the forthcoming funding, and they did this immediately. What that then did is it put the life of Palestinian refugees in Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, West Bank, and Gaza at risk. UNRWA is their main lifeline for food, for education, for maintaining the registry of refugees. And it's done this for generations, unfortunately. And in Gaza, then specifically, it is the most effective way to distribute humanitarian aid. And so when you see Israel making unfounded allegations, and reports are now arising that those 9 employees, or I think now it's down to 7, they reduced the number. Some of them might have given testimony under torture. That's to be further explored. And these funders reacted so quickly and so I think it's vicious, their response. They punished all the Palestinian refugees across all these territories because of these unfounded allegations. To put it into context, there's 30,000 employees of UNRWA. So by any standard of employment, this was clearly a political response, a political punishment against all Palestinians, revealing that it's not just a war in Gaza.
And that's the knockout effect that it had. And then some funders then restored their funding, given that no evidence were provided afterwards.
Exactly.
And the public outcry about it. You've mentioned the spread of the famine and the consequences of it, and the numbers of people are are dying from hunger is unprecedented. But there are other war zones, active war zones at the moment in different parts of the world, where people suffer from starvation. And food is unavailable to any satisfactory level, just to mention Yemen or Sudan. And comparative exercises always should be done very cautiously. But I wonder whether we can either compare the situations, whether with respect to the root causes or the solutions moving forward. In other words, what can we, and previous events in history, where countries that were torn through war and armed conflicts have come out of it. Can you tell us something about how people in Gaza might recover if and when the war ends?
Yeah. No, I share with you, and I've been asking myself this question, and I've been talking to a lot of starvation experts. And let me just, be very frank. The right to food, the mandate holders, generally speaking, have focused on structural issues in food systems and causes of hunger. And the right to food community, in terms of activism and expertise, unfortunately, is a different community and group of experts and activists around starvation and famine. That's already problematic, right? And so one thing many of us are trying to do is to understand this as a spectrum of violence across, and it's a matter of different speeds. Also, to your point, it is kind of hard to compare different atrocities, different moments of starvation. So where I'm at in my thinking is this, that Sudan right now is a major concern. Yemen has been a concern for many years now. And these places of starvation often don't get any political attention. What is unique about Gaza, again, is the speed. The speed, and in terms of, you mentioned the IPC report, Noam, talking to those experts who are members of the IPC and the Famine Review Committee, they said, we've never seen so many people in terms of how they measure. This is the highest degree they've ever had that they've seen since they've created this metric, and that's speed. So if we understand Gaza being unique in those terms, I think it's kind of to go back to the beginning of our conversation, then it's important to, I think, to contextualize each situation of starvation in the history of where it's happening. I think that gives us a better sense of why. The comparison, what the trend that we are seeing on a global scale is, unfortunately, ever since 2011, since Somalia, we are seeing more and more instances of famine and starvation around the world. So what that tells me is that the international system is not effective in reducing the chances or eliminating the fact that people are starving and that there is famine. Um, and one might even argue that the international system might be enabling it in many ways. So there's that trend of we're seeing increased rates of famine or near famine. We're seeing people who are starving communities. There's just impunity. There isn't real accountability. And then when we come to Gaza, that speed, I think that then becomes particular to the history of Palestinian liberation, living under occupation, living in an apartheid situation, and living in a settler colony. That gives us a better understanding of how Israel is able to do it so quickly, and tells us why people have mobilized around Gaza in a profound way. We have never seen the global solidarity movement around the Palestinian people's right to self-determination. We've never seen such a high degree of global solidarity than we have seen now. So what we understand then now, I think that tells us, is what's at stake. What is at stake in Gaza is something that that affects everybody, which is this the world we want to live in which we allow for genocide, starvation, and occupation with no consequence? Is this a world where we want to live in where people's human rights are ignored, explicitly ignored, not just by governments, but their allies as well? So I think the stakes of Gaza have this profound global effect on it in terms of the international system, however one defines it.
That, that's interesting. I think there is an internal tension there, because on the one hand, we have a genocide live streamed on social media, and people all over the world know about it in real time. So there is no issue of suggesting that the media has not reported or people were ignorant, whether the common people or people in decision-making powers, whether on national or international levels. The perpetrators broadcast their own war crimes on social media as well, taking pride in their actions. So no one is trying to camouflage their actions. Decision makers, politicians declare in October that starvation is their goal, that siege is their goal, that there are no innocent people in Gaza, and that's their modus operandi since. We see that the numbers of Palestinians killed, 34,000 Palestinians have been killed, more than 14,000 children, thousands under the rebel. This information is there. So on the one hand, we have this rise of international solidarity, but at the same time, I would say complete failure of the international system, which does not prevent it. And many actors, many powerful actors, Australia, the US, are enabling it by providing diplomatic support, by providing the infrastructure and the weaponry that enables this war machine to continue for 6 months. So there's some kind of tension here between these two trends, if you would like.
Yeah.
And then comes the UN human rights system into the game, and the international legal system into the game.
Right. And well, that's so well put, Noam. I would add, it's not a tension, it's a crack. It's a big crack in the system. If we understand that international law, and maybe failure might be not the right word, but international law has allowed this, that it's made space for it to go back to our early part of the conversation. For decades, it's enabled this. And every instance of starvation is putting cracks in the system. Every instance of genocide has been cracks in the system, right? Whether it's former Yugoslavia or Rwanda. And there's something about this moment in Gaza that I think is one of the biggest cracks, an existential crack. And the choice is this a crack that we're going to allow for more darkness to spread? Or is this a crack that will finally just create the sort of let the damn thing tumble down, the international system, and from the wreckage, from the what's left, we can build something anew that would not allow this to happen, or would ensure the conditions make it very difficult to happen. So people are mobilizing, and the human rights system, the Human Rights Council did nothing for 6 months. Nothing. There was more political energy at the General Assembly, even the constant vetoing that happened at the Security Council. At least there was political wrangling. The Human Rights Council, there was very little until very recently. Until recently, I would say, I think it was something like last week or so, where the Human Rights Council, in the context of a standing resolution regarding the Palestinian people's right to self-determination, put out a strong resolution calling for a ceasefire. And I think what makes it powerful, it's calling for a ceasefire again within a long-standing resolution focused on the Palestinian people's right to self-determination. Finally, so who has been the part of the UN system that's been the fastest and the loudest? It's the volunteer, unpaid, like I'm sitting in my attic yelling into my computer. My microphone happens to be working well today. It was me and my colleagues who are all the other mandate holders. We were in the many of us happened to be in New York in this third week of October. We put out the first, within the UN system, the first alarm saying there is a risk of genocide, and we happened to be at the General Assembly. We presented our warning in person to the General Assembly in October. So they had noticed as early as that there's a risk of genocide. And then the issue of starvation very quickly was also there. So to add to your point, not only was it available in the media, it was available through official channels as well, like in terms of process. But it's so unfortunate that it's the sort of most underfunded part of the UN human rights system that was the most nimble. But that's often the case. That's often the case in any institutional space. And the response remains slow, but it's because people have mobilized, because people continue to organize and mobilize and speak out, whether it's in their workplace, at home, just chatting to people, or organizing more broadly through professional organizations, through their unions, or on the streets through demonstrations. That's what's putting real political pressure, and it's working. It's forcing institutions and political actors to respond because the stakes are so profound, and I would say existential.
And they are. I think your press releases since October demonstrate that. And I think you and your colleagues in your joint statement have used unprecedented language, most likely because it's an unprecedented or extreme situation on the ground. The UN Committee on the Rights of the Child has used several statements and very harsh language that this committee has never used in the past. The Human Rights Council did absolutely nothing. And then ironically, I would say the only UN actor that did something was the ICJ, which is the last institution that you expect to act swiftly or with any sense of urgency. Hearing the communication from South Africa, holding the hearings, then making the preliminary decisions, issuing interim orders in January, haven't been followed according to South Africa and those who asked to intervene in that case. But the decision has been made, which assuming there will be some consequences one day to Israel's lack of compliance with those interim measures. But it was the ICJ, the most, I would say, conservative, institutionally heavy, rather than the fast-speeding movement of academics who are in these voluntary positions like yourself and your colleague, who can sit in their attic without wearing a gown and inform us as to what's going on and putting things in context, or without any enforcement mechanism that comes with the mandate of the ICJ. Which brings me to the question of accountability. You've mentioned accountability a number of times. And we were trying to touch point on the question of how the day after will look like. So the question of the day after for the people who live in Gaza at the moment, and how their life will look like, and how their recovery will look like, and who's going to pay for it, and how where going to be any houses that can go back to. 70% of the houses were demolished. The question of livelihood is a live question for victims and survivors on the ground. But on the legal level and political level, how will accountability might look like?
Yeah.
In the 90s, we saw the war in Yugoslavia resulting in the establishment of the ICTY. In Rwanda, 30 years, marking 30 years for the genocide in Rwanda this week, the ICTR was established. People were indicted and incarcerated afterwards. The ICC has done, and the prosecutor has done absolutely nothing with respect to Israel war crimes since October and beforehand.
Yeah.
So the whole issue where the international criminal law system functions and to what degree. But what can happen at that level, and what can happen, what your expectations are from countries? Australia, with universal jurisdiction clause or other mechanism that they might employ.
Yeah. I mean, first to go to the ICJ, I mean, as an international lawyer of a particular tradition, I was surprised by how much I was caring about the International Court of Justice, which in the past I'm like, oh, it's this slow-moving, slightly outdated, kind of ridiculous institution. If you focus on the ICJ, that's not where the action is in international law. And here we are where I've never seen a case where so many just people, not lawyers, people are watching it in real live. My entire family now, I think that we are experts on ICJ process. Like everyone was watching it, but it wasn't, if I might say, I don't think it was the ICJ, it was South Africa that moved. And their pleadings were, I think, not just legal arguments, which they were very strong and clearly made and well done legal arguments. They captured the power and spirit and feeling that people were expressing in their mobilization, in their social movements. So it's not just that South Africa can recognize genocide and apartheid because of its own history. Of course, that's at the core issue, the core driving element. But it's that also that South Africa comes from a tradition of liberation movements. And so that sort of that energy of movements is part of their political and legal practice today, historically and in contemporary terms, that how they made their presentation at the ICJ, I think was really also powerful and unique and sort of was that the motor behind all of that. And to be honest, then the judges did not provide the clearest language in their first preliminary judgment. Then the second round happened because starvation was a concern. South Africa brought updated request. And to the point that then the ICJ made more preliminary judgments. And 6 judges added, they said, well, we don't think it's clear enough. What we should be saying is ceasefire. They wanted to be so clear that they felt that still the judges are not using the clearest language that they can use. So the ICJ in some ways has been really unique and exciting in some ways, but then at the same time, it's falling back into its old habit. But things are changing. The definition of genocide is now being deployed in a way that is not the way many genocide experts thought it would be used. So genocide experts gave us 16,000 different reasons why it'd be difficult to make a genocide argument. But the reality, the social, political, and military reality was actually this is not hard to show that it is genocide. But then to more specifically your question on afterwards, the rebuilding, I think if we understand this accountability, the problem, I think there's many problems with international criminal law as such. One of them being it's like criminal law in general, it's not a good deterrent. Very few actors think, oh no, I might go to jail. I should not make this decision as an individual. That's rarely how domestic or international criminal law works. And then the remedy is putting individuals in jail. But that's not the cause. And I think that's what's important about how we name particular horrors. How we name things, especially in law, reveals and identifies what's at stake and tells us and provides a particular remedy. So by framing it as a genocide, who is accountable is the state of Israel itself, highlighting that it is structural and historical and longstanding, and that the state of Israel is accountable and all its allies are accountable. And I would add starvation. So starvation, I think, is too narrowly defined as a violation of international criminal law. So part of this forthcoming report I'm working on is to say starvation should be understood as a fundamental violation of all of international law, including, of course, human rights. Again, to understand the structural systemic elements of it, so that the remedy is the full recognition and realization of the Palestinian people's right to self-determination and reparations. That's how what is not because the worry is when the war will finally end, and it will end, that all of the money that will come for rebuilding and reconstruction will be conditioned, will be in the form of maybe loans, will be provided or aid with particular conditions, and will be I mean, everything will be politicized. Of course, money is always politicized, but be politicized in a way that is not uh, giving Palestinian people power and that right to determine their own fate and their own future and to rebuild their own community unless it's framed as reparations. And by understanding it as reparations, then the obligation of Israel, of all the countries that have provided military, financial, and political support to Israel in this war, are responsible and have no right to provide the conditionalities that they want to impose. And rather, the challenge then becomes what sort of fund do we create in which that money is collected as a matter of reparations, and that the Palestinian people then have the right to access and to use on their own terms. That's a different question. That's a challenge. That's not an easy question, but that would be a different question, I think.
And then I think they will say they will come when you see how this thing unfolds and materializes. You mentioned that the accountability goes to the state of Israel rather than to individuals who might be indicted under international criminal law or under a domestic system that holds and have and execute the universal jurisdiction powers. But then if this political entity is the one that is the center of our attention, then you go back to Judge Barak, the ad hoc judge from Israel at this ICJ case, saying in his dissenting opinion, this is the second independence war. Israel has the right to defend itself. It was attacked. It was under threat. It exercises its right to self-defense in the name of its right to self-determination. Mistakes happens. The Israeli army corrects them. It will, in time, will investigate what went wrong and if people acted not according to procedures and to their orders. But those ad hoc incident should not cloud the legality of Israel's actions.
Yeah.
Do you see any merit to this line of argument?
No, that's a silly argument. That's my, technical response. But I mean, all dark humor aside, first and foremost, there's no exception to genocide. That's just a legal fact. There's no exception to genocide. And so even if there's a risk of genocide, which is where the court is at, there's a plausible case of genocide is the most they can say right now, which is also a way of saying there is a risk of genocide. So there's also a legal obligation to prevent genocide without exception. This is why we need to take things out of international criminal law and international humanitarian law. The laws of war and the international humanitarian law are the laws of organizing violence in a particular way, of identifying what is legitimate, who's a legitimate target, and what is a proportional amount of violence. That is not what we should be talking about. In this particular context, what we're talking about is, again, within the court, we'll say a risk of genocide, I would say amongst every human rights expert that I've worked with within the UN system. So we're saying it is a genocide. I would add then starvation, unfortunately, as it's currently framed as international criminal law, allows for certain exceptions of military necessity and what have you. But I think that's actually not an operational definition of starvation. You can't starve combatants without starving civilians. It's physically impossible. So there should not be an exception to starvation either, which is the argument I will be making. So that's one part. Second, it ignores the context of Israel as an occupying power. This is established in international law. And And so it doesn't have the right to defend itself in the context of its occupation. Now, that's a different conversation if we're talking about, what international laws has Hamas violated. We can have that conversation, right? That's something one can talk about. But that's a different conversation than talking about Israel's obligations, other countries' obligations, what exceptions are available to them, um, et cetera, et cetera. And it's telling that, that is a common, Barak's argument is a common argument made by Israeli jurists and their allies. It's a way of having a different argument over context. So it's not just legal arguments. Are we talking about the context of occupation and apartheid and a settler colony? Or are we talking about, in their terms, it's almost like they're framing it as an international conflict, or I'm not sure what. Like it keeps it in this narrow framework of conflict, of war, and what have you. And that's not what's at stake.
Part of our moving forward part of the discussion, which is coming to we soon need to close it. In your latest statement, Human Rights Watch report that came yesterday that I mentioned in my opening, there is a call joining other calls for an arms embargo and for other sanctions. What's your expectation in terms of who should impose these embargoes and whether it should be saved for arms dealing or for other goods or for movement of people? What do you envision that the international community should do using this tool?
I think so many international tools have been attempted, right? From trying to do something at the Security Council, the Secretary General invoking Article 99 of the Charter, Human Rights Council resolutions, General Assembly resolutions, ICJ rulings, human rights reports through the special procedures. So many tools. What's not been used is the International Criminal Court prosecutor has been slow and has done nothing, granted, sure. So many legal tools, and we're at 6 months into this, I mean, to call it a war, into this horror, right? Into this genocide, into this starvation. Starvation being a social trauma that will echo for generations to come. And yet Israel, sometimes at the Security Council, before they even vote, will say, we're not going to follow whatever you decide. And what's so, I think, unique about this war is how Israel and the United States have not even bothered to try and use international law to justify their actions. It's so different than other wars. It's almost like they've exited international law itself at times, is the way they justify their actions. Or if they use international law, it's in this narrow, almost obscure way at times. Like the United States claiming that the most recent Security Council resolution that did pass, calling for a ceasefire, was not legally binding. I mean, that was such a obtuse argument they were making. So we're at the stage where the bare minimum is an arms embargo. Like that, we've been calling for that for months, which is bare minimum where there is a clear risk of genocide and an ongoing starvation campaign. And again, probably, I would say, actual genocide. Then if you are sending any military support, so not just in the form of ammunition, and weapons, but any military support, you are aiding and abetting starvation and genocide. You are complicit as a country. No doubt. So and people have been demanding that for months on the street. So that for me is an easy argument. And unfortunately, governments are just processing that now. The other part to your question, Noam, which is a broader sanctions. And I think that's important to discuss, which is you have a country that keeps thumbing its nose at the UN, at international law, and at basic moral humanity itself, with no accountability, with a sense of impunity, with no consequence for 6 months. In the least, there should be sanctions. Also, broader economic sanctions, diplomatic sanctions. Some Latin American countries cut off diplomatic ties pretty quickly. Now countries, and I know countries are now considering economic sanctions. The ones who should be considering it are those in the region. I know Turkey is now finally seriously discussing it, but the Arab countries that have treaties and economic and political relationships with Israel, they've done nothing. They've done nothing despite their own people's demands. And the reason I say this is this is what's been asked for by Palestinian people for years now. So it is coming from people within, and that will bear some of the consequences, good and bad. And the historical record, I mean, that was a significant part of what ended apartheid in South Africa. It wasn't the only part, but that was part of that campaign. And so I think that needs to be the next stage of arms embargo, of course, and you're going to be held accountable if you keep providing military support. And I know that I'm talking to an Australian audience, and I know the Australian government has provided military support. So that's almost a no-brainer. The time will come where the Australian government will be held accountable for aiding and abetting in a genocide and starvation. But then it's what are we doing to prevent it? And that's the broader sanctions, political, economic, diplomatic, cultural. There's discussions in terms of the Olympics and the like.
Your vision that coming up. We are coming to the end of our conversation. I would like to end with if you may, with a personal question. It's been 6 months now, and as you said, you've been very active day or night, sitting in your attic, talking to whoever wants to hear it. And some people don't want to hear it, or have some comments that might be unpleasant. So what's the experience of being a human rights defender these days?
Yeah, I'm pausing. Last night I live in Eugene, Oregon. Last night I was in Portland, Oregon, at an event organized by Physicians for Palestine, which is a national movement here in the United States. And on the panel were doctors and nurses that had just come back from Gaza. And it was their stories, and their stories were filled with, of course, a description of the horrors, but a description of the humor and the love and the hospitality that they experienced in Gaza in the last few months as well. So it's always, I don't want to direct the attention to myself that I'm doing my job and I'm traveling, Geneva, Rome, New York, and talking directly to governments that don't want to hear it. And there's my colleague Francesca Albanese has been threatened publicly by the spokesperson for the State Department of the United States. So people, and I've received threats, but that's that comes with the job. Threats to my family, etc. But the point is, all these personal attacks are a way of distracting from people in Gaza, from distracting from the Palestinian people's struggle for their human rights, and it's to create a climate of fear to scare people off. But it's not working. It's not working because the support and the growing support to end this war, to call for a ceasefire, for an arms embargo, and to actually push for Palestinian people's right to self-determination is growing, and it's encouraging. And then in my conversations with people in Gaza, it's I think, we chat and we talk, and it's at first I think, oh my goodness, how are we gonna life goes on despite the horror, and you still have to worry about your kids, and you still have to deal with the day-to-day. And so, that's how I think about that question, which is, I'm doing my job. Whenever people like me get personally attacked, that means we're doing something right, and that means that those people who are attacking us have no argument to make other than to create a climate of fear, and that means they've already lost.
This semi-optimistic tone, I think it's time to thank you very much, Professor Michael Fakhri, for coming and speak with us, the Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food. And thank you for the Australian Human Rights Institute for organizing and hosting this webinar. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. And thank you and goodbye.
Thank you, Noam, for such a generous conversation. Bye-bye.